everyone, thank you for coming. My name is Robin Fowler, and as Mary said, I'm going to be talking about a project that I did in Engine 100. I'll focus more on the measuring because I imagined that this group was sort of a big data group who was excited to think about how to quantify or qualify the results here in order to consider what that might mean for our teaching practices. I want to start off by thanking the first set is my colleagues, so these are people who I've co-taught Engine 100 with and who've been kind enough to let me do strange things in their classes. I need to thank people through CRLT. So as Mary said, I had an investigating student learning grant, and I had lots of really wonderful mentoring, especially from Mary and from Cindy Finelli, and from Erping Zhu and the Teaching with Technology Institute, because this project actually started there. And finally from Patrick and Robin Dixon, who are College of Education faculty at MSU, who've been also observing this process and suggesting things that I might want to consider. Okay, so Intro to Engineering is an interesting course here at the university. It is team taught, which means that I represent communication in my courses, but there's someone from one of the engineering disciplines also leading a project. It's team-based, so the students work on teams typically of 4 or 5 students on whatever the project is. In my sections, they're doing a design, build, and test project. And so they're given a scenario. It's problem-based learning. They need to come up with a design. And then in at least my sections, they actually build that design and test it. And then finally, they communicate about it. And I love that as an instructor of writing because my students are actually working on an authentic project. It's a project that's different for different teams. It's something that typically they're fairly motivated about. But as a team, they're doing all these things. In my specific sections, or at least in the specific sections that I'm talking about data here, they're building a remote operated vehicle or they're building a small scale wind turbine. And there are a few ways that these specific sections will play out in the data, so I wanted to make sure to explain that. The pedagogical problem that I saw in my classes. There is a meeting early in the semester when the teams are first meeting with their design team. And I started reserving rooms in my building. So I had different rooms, different students meeting in each room, and I was running between the rooms to watch these meetings. And the students need to get together on a team of 4 or 5 students and decide what they're going to build. And typically what I saw was someone who'd done a lot of thinking about the project. We're going to build a blank, and it's going to be amazing, and it's going to have these characteristics. And everyone else smiling and nodding and saying, yeah, that sounds great. And I don't know whether it was this person seems loud and confident, and therefore they must know what they're doing, and so I'm not going to speak up. Or whether it was it's easier to follow someone else's lead, or it's easier because maybe I won't even have to do as much of the project because if that person is sort of taking over the project, I can kind of freeload. But anyway, I saw this team dynamic. And one of the things that I felt like I noticed was that particular people were fairly silent in these conversations. And specifically, those were people who are at risk in the engineering education literature of dropping out of engineering, often women and often minority students. So I hypothesized that participation might be better in an electronic space, and this is based on a big literature review that I'm not really going to go into here. But there's a lot of evidence that a few things might change the dynamics of this conversation. Decreased social presence. So if I'm there in the room and I'm the only woman, my womanness becomes very available to me as something that I think about, and I might suffer from something like stereotype threat, where I'm less willing to suggest to someone else, no, here are reasons that this idea actually is a problem. The relaxed synchronicity. So synchronicity is the idea of how quickly things happen, how much the turn-taking happens in real time. If you think about in a face-to-face conversation, as I'm saying something, if Eric wants to now say something, he needs to actually figure out this pause right as I'm finishing what I say and interject his statement at exactly that moment, right? And if I'm sitting at a table with Eric and Rob and Mary Jane, and Mary Jane also wanted to enter that conversation there, but Eric better timed his comment, he's going to be the one who gets to speak, and Mary Jane has to stay silent, right? In an online chat space, there's this relaxed synchronicity, which means that Eric and Mary Jane can both be typing their answers at the same time. They can both hit send. Those things can happen at different times, and they both get to contribute to the conversation anyway. And finally, it's a text-based conversation. In the College of Engineering, at least in my classes, my non-native student, my non-native English speaker student number is something like 10%. And I know from having been a student in Uruguay that I'm a whole lot better at communicating my ideas in Spanish if I get to write them than if I have to speak them verbally. So I think that the text-based conversation also impacted student participation. So for these reasons, I thought I want to come up with some other way for my students to communicate, and I want to do it in some sort of context that will allow for these things. So I went to the Teaching with Technology Institute. I met with Erping Zhu, who suggested, Google Docs, which you're using anyway for other things, might actually work really well for this context. I gave my students a single Google Doc per team. I used the Google Sketchpad option. So basically they're all in this sketch space. They're all adding lines, they're drawing their ROV or whatever it is that they're drawing. And there's a chat space along the side. So there's a running chat. It's text-based. It's often written with emoticons and abbreviated things, and they're interacting in this chat space. They also can add comments on the page, or even text on the page. In general, these have been limited, and I didn't include those in my analysis. And one of the things that I want to emphasize here is that, so this is my experimental manipulation. I also have control students who participated face-to-face the same way as they always have, and it was a single point in the semester. So I was doing this in the context of the constraints of an already existing course that was working fairly well, and trying to push my co-instructors to say, we're going to do something crazy. So we did it for a single meeting, and that's what I'll be talking about today. So the brief method section, the teams were assigned pseudo-randomly to the online or the face-to-face groups. And what I mean by that is I didn't just draw numbers to decide who would be in which section. I made sure that a lot of things were counterbalanced. So there are an equivalent ratio of students from each of my two sections in the two groups. There are an equivalent number of teams that have different dynamics in terms of the number of women on them. So that's why it is pseudo-random as opposed to actual random assignment to groups. I ended up doing this over 4 semesters, and I have 232 students on 54 teams of about 4 or 5. Of those groups, 65 of my students were women, 31 of them were non-native speakers of English. You'll see that I have more students meeting online than face-to-face. And that was actually an economic decision because I was paying someone to type up the transcripts from the face-to-face meetings. And also it had to do with the fact that I was noticing that my online students were actually having better outcomes. And so from an ethics decision, it felt like if I really believe that this is a better situation, then I need to be putting more students into that context. Finally, I have an online survey to measure their sense of their own participation, as well as their satisfaction with the meetings. So now I have a bunch of transcripts, right, from my 54 teams. Those transcripts I needed to code somehow, and I needed to actually unitize them. So sometimes when people have an entry, they've just written, yes, agreed, send. Sometimes they've written a paragraph of text describing where the thruster should go and how this will be optimal for these reasons. And I needed to figure out how to weight that so that that big participation got counted more. I separated things into T units, which for non-linguists, it's good enough to say this is an independent clause, this is a complete sentence. So basically I took the long paragraphs, turned them into complete sentences. If you're a linguist, we can talk about how this is very slightly different from that, but I think for this group that's good enough. From these numbers of T units, so now I have each person has, this person said 33 T units, and this person said 15 T units, and this person said 40 T units. I turned it into a standardized participation score. So I took their number of T units, divided it by the average number of T units contributed by someone on their team. And what this does is it makes my groups of 4 and 5 more comparable, because of course in a time frame, groups of 5 have a little bit less opportunity to participate. And finally, the T units have also been coded. So each T unit has been coded according to rhetorical function and according to the object of discussion. So I have a lot of data here, and I'm imagining that this is a big data group. So I'm hoping that at the end you'll want to talk with me about what else I can do with this. I'll report some responses to 4 research questions, but I think that there are a lot more research questions we could look at with all this data. Oh, okay, so that's what I was going to say. So I have 54 transcripts, which are actually qualitative data. That turns into 7,590 T units that have each been coded for these categories. For 232 speakers, I have demographic and their survey information, as well as the number of T units, the standardized participation, and then their participation based on rhetorical function or object of discussion. So for example, I might be able to investigate whether women are more likely to ask leading questions that further the conversation, or whether women are more likely to provide detailed description of things or things like that. And finally, these 54 teams have varying distributions of talk, as well as varying distributions of what types of talk happen. So what % of the conversation is about the actual thing that they're going to build, what % of it is off topic entirely, things like that. All right, so from this, I'm going to talk about 4 research questions today. How does condition affect overall participation? How does condition affect patterns of participation? How does condition affect participation of women? and how does condition affect participation of non-native speakers of English? So with the first question, what we find is it affects the overall participation in that the groups, the online groups seem to scale with size. This number is yellow because it's based on one team. Normally we wouldn't have a team of 6. We had 6 people in one discussion section, so they were all on a team. So this number take with a grain of salt. These numbers I threw into an ANOVA, and basically what I can see here is that there's no main effect of group size or of condition. So there's no difference between the overall participation in online versus face-to-face, and there's no difference in the participation on 4-person teams or 5-person teams in terms of the number of T units that happen in the conversation. But there is a marginally significant interaction where this number is bigger, right? Teams of 5 have more T units in the online context. And especially when I look at this, I feel like this is suggesting to me that groups that are meeting online, the group scales with group size, right? So if we think back to that idea of a synchronicity and Mary Jane and Eric both wanting to say something after I finished speaking, but Eric said it first and Mary Jane didn't get to speak. In these big groups, they can both be typing and both hitting enter. Does that make sense? All right, for research question number 2, looking at how the patterns of participation change. I think the easiest way to do this is to look at these histograms. And I know that these are fairly confusing diagrams, so I'm going to talk through them a little bit. So here on the y-axis, you see the standardized participation score. A standardized participation score between 0.9 and 1.1 is an average participant, right? That's what we would like to see. We'd like to see lots of those. People who are way up here were taking over the conversation. They were doing a whole lot more speaking than was expected. And people down here were hardly participating. They were sitting there fairly silent. And what you see with my online participants is a nice normal distribution centered around this group of people who we want to see. Face-to-face, you see a much flatter distribution. You see some people here right where we want them, right? But you also see quite a few people up here taking over the conversation, and quite a few people down here speaking very little or not at all. In fact, one of these people who spoke less than 10% of the time that you would expect said exactly one thing. It was a hello to the group as he entered the room. I feel like this is fairly compelling, but I didn't know how to do statistics on the actual distributions. So I manipulated these numbers by computing for each team a standard deviation and a range score. So the standard deviation number here is basically showing the number of T units for each of these people. And so there are 4 or 5 numbers only going into the standard deviation. It's not probably really an appropriate standard deviation measure, but it does show that that number will be inflated if there's a big difference. If somebody's taking over and somebody's speaking very little, the standard deviation number gets bigger, right? Range score, same thing. Person who talked the most minus the person who spoke the least. For both of these, it's not the case that an ideal team would have a standard deviation or a range of 0, but it is the case that big numbers indicate imbalance on the team. What we see is both of these numbers are smaller online than they are face-to-face. By about half, interestingly, in both cases. And t-tests of these numbers show that they're both significantly different, and very much so. Given that I only have 54 teams here, this is a pretty high significance to find. All right, research question 3 was asking about whether I found increased participation of women in the online context. I didn't find a main effect of gender or of condition or an interaction here. And I was surprised by that because this had been part of my motivation for doing the study. I had sat in some rooms where I saw women who I knew had lots of good ideas who were silent on their teams. So I decided to look at those same distributions that we did before. And this distribution is even more skewed than when you just look at the whole group entirely. So what you see is lots of women online speaking at this normal amount that we want to, with a few people speaking quite a bit, and no one speaking less than half as much as you would expect of the women in the online condition. In my face-to-face groups, I see a fairly flat distribution with lots of women speaking less than half as much as you would expect. I don't know how to test this one statistically. If you remember, the stats test that I did for the whole group involved a standard deviation and a range score for intact teams. But these women are stuck on teams of other people who are not women. And so I don't know how to test this, but I'm hoping that this group will come up with good ideas for that. And finally, research question 4, does it increase the participation of non-native English speakers? And I found here that there is a significant interaction. So again, there's no main effect of online versus face-to-face. There's no main effect of native English versus non-native speaker. But when I put my non-native speakers online, they speak a normal amount. And when I put them face to face, they speak much less than expected. So for me, this is a compelling finding that this online interaction enables participation of people who are not participating as much face to face as we would like. A few limitations. So I've sort of arbitrarily decided T units is a good way to unitize my participation, but of course still I have some T units that are things like, we should consider adding thrusters in these places because of these great ideas that that's going to do, and some that are, yes, agreed. So I'm still equating things that are not, right? I've done something to unitize it. And finally, I treated native speaker status as if it was categorical, but as everyone in this room knows, it's not. Some of my non-native speakers are very, very fluent and probably are not disadvantaged by their language. Some are very disadvantaged by their language. Interestingly, I still find an effect. I would have more power if I'd done something better to actually categorize fluency. So that suggests that I'm actually underfinding the effect there. So finally, I want to take this soapbox opportunity to encourage you to consider moving some of your team contexts online. I believe that that makes for a better pedagogical situation. You find fewer cases of low participation or of team domination. You have more opportunity for members of large teams especially to participate. So if you remember the group of 4, 5, and 6, that more people participated, there were more participation units as the group was online, but face-to-face they were all constrained by this space where there's still 15 minutes to speak and one person gets to speak each amount of time. And finally, something that we didn't expect, this provided an interesting window into team thinking. When I was running around between the rooms, I would get to stand there for a few minutes and hear the team talking about something, and I might realize, oh, this team is doing something very strange that I need to address next week in lecture. But I think most of the time they were very sensitive to, my instructor is standing here, and so their conversation became much less likely to address the things that were risky or weird in terms of what they were communicating, or sometimes they just got silent. But in this context, I'm lurking in all of the Google Docs conversations simultaneously. Sometimes I actually decide to intervene in the meetings. I didn't during data collection. Sometimes I decide, okay, that's something that I'm going to make sure that we address as a group later. But it provided me an extra window as an instructor into what my students are thinking and how I need to address that in terms of class. Okay, so I have lots of next steps. I have all of these rhetorical coding and topics, and that took a lot of time. So I want to do some sort of analysis based on that. I'm considering doing some sort of qualitative analysis of the transcripts, or some qualitative study, like perhaps interviews with some of the participants, especially some of the participants who are fairly silent face-to-face, or who spoke quite a bit who spoke quite a bit online, who I felt like would have been silent in a face-to-face context. I'm also open to other ideas from this group. I'm excited to be here with this group because I think that you're likely to be people who have lots of good ideas for me. So that's all. I'm going to switch over to Christine, but I want to encourage you to think about these things because we'll have time at the end for questions, and I'd like your good ideas.
I think I'm going to clap for you.
Okay.
And now for something completely different. So my presentation, whoops, let's see, there we go. So my presentation focuses on something that we've made but not measured. So I'm here to get your thoughts and suggestions about how to use this project in a way that can be measured, interestingly. It all started with the Mellow 3D group, and some of those people are right here in the room. This is a photo of our team. Mellow 3D is Michigan Education Through Learning Objects. It's an interdisciplinary group of people from 6 or 7 different departments who work on adapting and integrating web-based electronic learning objects. Learning objects, really quick definition, are basically materials for education that can be used for instruction, practice, or assessment. Sometimes a learning object will do all 3, sometimes it'll just do one of those. So you could have a simulation online of a physics problem that would maybe instruct, practice, and evaluate, or you could have a collection, this is one of my favorites, of leaves from a biology department that would really just be something that you look at and learn about. So there's a lot of variation. One important feature of learning objects is that they do provide a way for students to get feedback. And right here is the thorny moment for a writing teacher. Because we believe, as sort of an article of faith, frankly, that feedback to students on their writing is best provided by a human reader and not by a machine. And I work in a writing center, and I spend 10 hours a week talking to individual students about their writing. And that's not just those aren't my students, those are just students from all across the university. So we believe that writing is this human communicative act, and trying to find something that can help students with their writing online is a hugely controversial subject in my field of study. So how could I possibly create a learning object that would provide a robust and interesting way for students to work on their writing? Learning objects in the field of writing tend to fall into some categories. Some are tools for writing, for example. So you might have, for instance, a mind mapping software that would allow students to plug ideas into a mind map and show relationships among those ideas. That's a great tool for writing. It doesn't provide any feedback. It's for the student to use. Google Docs are a tool for writing. Google Forms, any kind of thing like that. There are also a ton of great online handbooks and textbooks, but they're basically text-based, they're not interactive, they're just providing material for students to read on their own. There are handouts. The Sweetland Center for Writing is awash in handouts that students can download and use for their own purposes. And those are great learning objects, but they're not interactive. The most interactive things that tend to be made for teaching writing are grammar drills, because they can function on a binary system. Either you get the answer right or wrong. A computer can match the word that you insert into a text box. Those kinds of things you can get perfectly fine feedback on. But the kind of interaction, the rich interaction that we experience in the Writing Center is really hard to replicate online. And a lot of these tools, especially the text-based ones, don't really take advantage of the richness of an online environment, which I would characterize in these 4 ways. I wod say that the affordances or the advantages of an online environment for student learning are that it is multimodal. You can apply to or appeal to sight and sound. You can also have text, image combined in one unit or one item, one object. And so it provides a really rich learning environment. It is also interactive. The user has to engage in at least a rudimentary way with the screen, mousing over, typing, something like that, so that there's engagement there on the part of the learner. In addition, and maybe this is the more important thing, it's learner-centered. We all proceed at our own paces through web material. And so we can choose what we need to learn. We can select from menus. We can pursue the things that we want to. We can go back, unlike a lecture, right? We can go back and look at it again. We can repeat. So it's very learner-centered and learner-determined, the path through the material. And finally, increasingly social, especially if you're using things like Twitter or Facebook or blogging for an online learning object. You can make it social. You can have students interact with each other on that online learning environment. And I think Tim McKay's example from physics is a really good one for that. So the question, there we go. The question that arises for me is, how can we harness that power of the online learning environment to help student writers work on significant writing issues, not necessarily grammar or correctness, the things that a computer can evaluate, that your basic grammar check on Word can evaluate, but issues like organization, developing purpose, developing audience awareness, and improving a writing process. So the significant writing issue we picked out of all of these many ones that we thought we could actually apply some of the richness of an online learning environment to was revision. Revision is a very thorny challenge for a lot of incoming writers, high school writers who are coming into college for the first time. This is what we might call in a lecture a muddy point, right? What does it mean to revise? What counts as revision? What is meaningful revision? How do I go about doing it? All of those questions are really challenging because most students have a relatively, when they enter college, have a relatively simplistic or superficial view of the writing process and of revision. For instance, let me give you a couple of examples from my students' reflections on their definition of a writing process. I look for weak or unnecessary sentences and try to fix them. as well as attempt to find grammatical errors within my paper. So there's definitely an emphasis on correctness and on fixing things, but often at the sentence level, not at the discourse level. I rephrase sentences as well as adding and deleting them. Okay, some editing there, but not what writing teachers think of as revision, rethinking, re-seeing something. I look for grammatical errors and change them, and I look to see if my draft is organized well. If it's not, I switch sentences or ideas in a section to a paragraph where they would fit better. So moving to a slightly higher order, but still just sort of moving things around, putting the sentences in the right boxes, if you will. Not really re-seeing the paper, reconsidering purpose, or coming to a new discovery through the process of revision, which is all the stuff that writing teachers aspire to. So not necessarily what we're hoping for with our students. So we set out some goals for creating a learning object that would help students address revision. One of them was to harness some peer-to-peer learning in this system. Our goal was not necessarily to preach the English teachers one way of revising, in the way that they've been told that there's only 5 paragraphs in an essay and each paragraph makes a distinct point and you have a summary at the end. We wanted them to see that there was a variety and that there were successful writers all over the university who had very different processes for engaging in revision. We also wanted to help them think about, we wanted to use new media to encourage their reflection and interaction. So we wanted there to be opportunities for them to interact with other writers somehow in the learning object. We wanted to create a resource, a learning object that can be adapted to classrooms and students so that they could take the thing we've created, it's not specific to our class in any way, and then move it into their own classroom and use pieces of it in whatever way that instructor wanted. So we wanted something that could be adapted for classroom use. But we also wanted to create a resource that stands by itself, that a writer who is Googling revision process would come up with this resource and find something useful there, that they could direct themselves towards things that would be useful and interesting to them. So overall, just give students some tools and ways of thinking about revision to develop a more robust view of that. The thing we came up with is called the Revision Project. And it actually comes up pretty high in Google searches if you type the Revision Project in quotation marks. This is a website, it's just based on a WordPress platform. It's nothing particularly complicated. We chose WordPress because we knew it and we knew we could do what we wanted with it, and it was free. And because it has some good features that blogs have. The main feature of our learning object are the videos of student writers. We interviewed 7 student writers, about 35 to 45 minutes apiece. These are all captured on video. We had a semi-structured interview format, so we asked many of them the same questions, but weren't afraid to follow up with them in longer conversations. We clipped these interviews according to topic, so sort of categorizing some of the short clips so that we could have several students addressing the same aspect of revision on each page. These students, very much a convenient sample. We weren't going for representativeness or comprehensiveness. We knew these students. We knew they were good at talking about their writing processes. We knew that they were experienced writers. And at least for my students, I knew that they weren't afraid to throw out a draft and start over again, which I thought, can be a powerful testimony to say, it's not working, let's just do it again. So they were mostly, I think, sophomores and juniors at the time that we interviewed them. So they had some writing experience, but they also feel like peers. And so I'm going to show you a really quick clip just of my student Hannah here. I hope this will play. It worked last night. Talking about her, how she manages time in a writing project. Uh-oh.
But it's really key for me when I go to revise something to have mental space and distance from the draft that I've just written. So I find myself needing to wait, from a few days to even a full week to really, come back and not be, kind of caught up with what I was trying to say in the draft and really look at what I was really saying in the draft.
Okay. First, we'll kill the buzz. And then we'll go back. So I think that Hannah is just one, let's see. There we go. One of these students who can really speak well in an approachable way about what she does as a writer, and give advice that students might not hear as well from me. If I say, well, let your paper rest, but they're really anxious about it, that's just that writing teacher's advice. But when Hannah says it and she makes a case for the merits of that, how she needs that space as a writer, I think it's a lot more persuasive. Let's see, I can keep using this. In addition to the videos, we have a lot of sort of framing or wrapping material around them that we think helps to make them more useful. One of the things we've included, because it's so easy to do on WordPress, is polls. So at the top of a lot of pages on each topic, we will ask students a question that we want them to get thinking about a key idea. So in this case, the question is, what are sources for? That's the question we ask students in the poll. And their options are to support my argument, to argue against, to refine and hone my ideas. And then they have an option to fill something else in. And we really want them to think about not just you go out there with a thesis and then you find 10 sources that support your thesis, but that the whole idea of learning and writing is to engage in a dialogue with your sources and to help them think and change your mind in some way. If your mind doesn't change during a writing process, you haven't really had a successful one. So the polls are kind of getting students thinking and also enabling them, once they've completed the poll, to see what other students have said, because the results of the poll are accessible once you've completed it. So you can see what your peers are saying, get a little bar graph that shows you. We also included opportunities for comments. Obviously there's a comment box. Is that the thing? No, that's not the thing, sorry. There's a comment box down at the bottom that you can use on every page, but then we've included additional comment boxes. What are some things you can do to get good feedback from readers? So asking students to think about, well, what have you just learned, and then how can you apply that to your own writing process? So sort of getting them to take the material and apply it in a way, also talking back, and thinking about whether they really fit into the model that we've provided them or not. Remember, we're not trying to present one way of writing or revising. We've also provided some teaching resources. So we've provided a set of lesson plans for teachers that incorporate various videos. There are also, it's kind of hard to see, I didn't realize how hard it would be to see my screenshots. Sorry about that. There are drafts from the student writer who talks about his revision process, so that a teacher could show the students the first draft of it, and then look at the second draft, compare the changes, and talk about why he made those changes, whether they were effective, and how he went through the process of making them. There's also example assignments. So this part isn't fully developed yet, but there's certainly our intention is to provide resources so that teachers can borrow pieces of this and incorporate it into their own writing, or into their own teaching. So just a very quick overview of kind of how the site's being used, because I'm really hoping for your feedback on how it could be used better and how we can measure its use. One of the things that we know is that we've had thousands of views, very exciting, 2,900 views over the course of time. Our best day ever was 95. So this is just using the statistics that are provided by WordPress. The average page view, number of page views per visitor seems to be about 2. Not as high as we'd like, but there it is for now. All over the world, of course the vast majority from the United States and other English-speaking countries, but every once in a while somebody from Romania or Thailand, which is kind of interesting. Somehow they're finding us. It's also kind of interesting to see how people get to us. By and large, coming through search engines. They're not coming through my link on my CTOL site. They're coming through search engines, which suggests maybe that most of them aren't my students. They're maybe from outside, and they're just randomly coming upon us. But they don't record IP addresses, so there's no way to know really where they're coming from. The Sweetland website refers us 42 people so far. And then the York County Community College in Maine seems to really like us, and we've gotten 33 views from them. I have no idea why. It's kind of interesting to me to think about what the top posts are. About the revision project, which is our main page, is the main post with 835 views. But then right after that is teaching ideas. So people are looking at the teaching, that teachers may be going to this more than students, or at least some teachers are going to it for teaching ideas. And then the question that most students want to answer is, what should I prioritize? How do I decide what's the most important thing to address in my revision? So these are just a few of the ways that we've tried to look at whatever data we've collected by the use of the website. My real questions, though, have more to do with its pedagogical application and what it would be, how it can be used in a classroom, and how it can facilitate student learning in something that is kind of hard to measure. So these are some research questions, and I'd be happy to know if you have other research questions or maybe some research answers. What effect, if any, does viewing the videos have on a visitor's revision process? So if after you view these videos, do you change your practice as a writer? What effect does viewing the videos have on a writer's ability to talk or think about revision in a more complex way? So if one of the things our students come in unable to do is to talk about their own writing process, does listening to other students who are more experienced talk about their writing process help them to articulate what they're doing in a more effective way? And then finally, do visitors who interact more with the site, who engage in the social or interactive things like polls, comments, and even the activities, that suggested activities we provide, do they engage in more extensive and effective revision? So those are our questions. And my big conclusion for you, which I cannot get to, there we go, is now that we've made it, how should we measure it? And thanks to the Liz's, Elizabeth Homan and Elizabeth Rodriguez, who are part of the writing team, Nancy Kerner, who's here, from Mello, one of the Mello founding mothers, my students who are learning what it means to really revise, and this seminar, and CRLT, especially Mary Wright, for the invitation. Thank you very much.
So now I'm going to invite questions for Christine and Robin. So they've posed some questions for you. You probably have some questions for them. And then also love your ideas about next steps to take their projects. So what questions or ideas do you have for them? Well, I have a question to start things off. So Christine, we presented some statements where students talked about the revision process. Can you talk a little bit about how you collected those? And if those might serve in some sense as a pre-test or a pre-measure that you could assess again after your students or other people's students watch the videos?
Sure. So I should probably use the mic, right, to answer that question. Is that better?
That's
To use
better.
the mic? Okay. And I realized I probably didn't do that very well during the presentation. So I just asked them a very simple question without very much elaboration. I just said, describe your typical revision process, and asked them to say what they typically do. It was not before class started, so it wasn't the first day, which would have been really, much more strategic of me to ask them then. I think that it could serve as a sort of pre-test, especially if it was in a class that didn't spend all its time talking about revision. So I worry about the interventions that I make by commenting on student papers, by talking with them in my office. It's very hard to sort of sort out those effects, I think. That's one of my concerns. Yeah.
Yes, in the back there.
This is something between people, but so you go forward, Christina. I mean, wait, I'll go to Rob. Robin, Christine. Robin, when you had your students working on their design question and they were online, was there a difference in the scope at which they got through? You quantified ideas, but if there was a difference in the scope, does it imply that there would be a better part of the design cycle to have them online? For example, is idea generation something that moves so quickly at times and has many, many ideas versus let's discuss a iteration on a given scope?
I think that's a good question. I do think that there was a difference in the scope, and I think it had to do with the handicapping of the groups who were online in terms of being able to illustrate what they were talking about. I think that the Google Sketchpad gave them some options, but it was not the same. It was interesting to me that the groups that were online did a lot of referring to things that were out in the real world. So people were pasting in pictures that they found. Let's build something like this really cool thing that the Navy has or whatever. I do think that probably it makes sense to do it at some other point in the design process in terms of furthering the conversation more. I was using it initially partly because these are not established groups, and I had at one point toyed with anonymity. And of course, for that, it needs to be the very first time that the teams are meeting. And so this is the very first time that the teams are meeting. I didn't do any sort of manipulation to make it anonymous, though. For me, I was really trying to impact the student dynamics as opposed to impacting the design process. And so for me, I think that this was still the appropriate time in the semester, but I think really from a design process perspective, it's not the right time in the semester.
So if you had the whole design process
Mm-hmm.
to choose, and you were going to do this exercise once, where would you put it?
So I think there's a lot of literature on collaborative decision making, and I think if I had some point in the design process where the teams were coming in with some set of established design ideas and they needed to down select to one, and the options were constrained such that it needed to be one of those, I think that sort of meeting makes a lot of sense online. I think that I had envisioned that this conversation was sort of like that, except that it's really not, because we're going to take the 4 or 5 design ideas that we've come with, and now we're going to figure out how to warp them all into a single design idea. And I think as soon as you introduce those sort of open-ended constraints, it doesn't become perfect anymore. Is that sort of an answer?
Yeah, thank you.
So Robin, how did you quantify the differences between a 2-word contribution to an online to a paragraph? Did you have some different measures for that?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
How do you quantify the difference of a 2-word I agree
Mm-hmm.
response in an online conversation to a carefully thought out paragraph?
Well, so that's why I used the T units. The carefully thought out paragraph became something like 8 entries, so a T unit is an independent clause plus all of its dependent clauses. For most of us, we can think of it as a complete sentence. I still have things that are 2-word yes or I agree, compared to I think we should put the thrusters as far out as possible. And I think that those still are not really comparable. But I don't have a whole paragraph coded as a single T unit. Now I have a paragraph coded as 8 T units, or however many it contains.
Excuse me, you talked a little bit about coding different kinds, or coding for different sorts of statements, but I don't think you had time to tell us then what kinds of choices you made on that. I'd be interested to hear that.
I actually, so Elizabeth is from my department. I used Christian Casper's doctoral codings. So there are 10 rhetorical codes. They involve information providing, simple and complex, information seeking, things that sort of smooth the discourse but that don't actually further the conversation. I can get you the actual list of the 10 codes. So there's the rhetorical coding, and then I also coded for object of discussion, and there I only had 4. I had things that were about what they were going to build, things that were about the design scenario. And sometimes it was difficult to distinguish these. There were a few things that were sort of if we need to be able to deal with cold temperatures, then we need to insulate our electronics, that were sort of in between the two. But sometimes they were very obviously about what they were building versus about the design scenario. I had things that were off topic but that were furthering the conversation. So things like, well, when we get to lab, we'll be able to see how much PVC there is. And then I had things that were off topic entirely. And I didn't have very many of those, except for with one team that got really excited about the new pope having been chosen during their meeting. But mostly there were very minimal of those. And I coded them, and then I had 10% of it was coded by someone else. And we have very high inter-rater reliability, something like 96%. So that's good. And the distinction that I made between the off-topic sort of, but furthering the conversation versus off-topic and really not, was if you were a teacher and you overheard this happening, you would go over and intervene.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of really interesting questions there and some possible interesting correlations between, say, conciliatory statements and, maybe female students.
Yeah. Yep, I haven't done any sort of analysis with that, but I have 7,600 units that I can do something with, so.
Tushia.
Yes, my question is for Christine. I'm curious about how you might use your website with your own students. So if you were to, your question earlier was about how might I measure how this is used. So I'm curious about how you actually integrate the use of this website perhaps in your own teaching. And perhaps that might be the population that you might begin working with to see how they reflect on the usefulness of the tool.
Yeah, absolutely. I haven't devised a protocol to measure their responses to the tool itself, but that would be definitely a way to go. The ways that I've used it are the ways that you might kind of expect. Often I will identify an issue that I think students are having in their revision process. Usually it's a lack of boldness. I would, sort of as an umbrella term, unwillingness to change much, right? Just to try to sort of satisfy the whole thing. And sort of getting students to talk or to listen to a student who talks about the importance of writing as a thinking process, and having them then write a reflection. How is your writing a thinking process? Or how is it not much of a thinking process? How is it sort of a downloading process? Can be useful to them, to have them write in response to viewing a video. I have a class blog, and putting a video up there and taking comments could be pretty useful. Also just having a discussion. What did you notice about the way this student talks about their writing process, and how does that compare to your own? Do you identify with that? Do you think that's kind of strange? Is it confusing or puzzling or whatever? So those are some ways that I've done it, but it hasn't been systematic or with the intention of creating data.
Yeah, I've got just an idea. It comes from a different field, though, about how you might measure how people use those learning objects online. Some of the national parks websites, when you're navigating partway through them, they have a little pop-up that comes up, and they ask you some things about how you were using it and why you were using it or whatever. It's completely, of course, voluntary and self-selecting. It has all those problems, but it's one strategy, and they must get something out of it to want to continue to do it. So it's from another field, but maybe it would help you.
Oh, I think that's a great idea. Sort of doing some meta, having people think in a meta way about the site, right? So how are you using this? What's been useful? Why is this your return visit? There's not really any way to track that, so it's hard to figure out how much time one person spends if they keep returning. That's really hard. A survey could help us get at a lot of that material. I think the challenge of using an open source kind of platform, an available and free platform, is that there's a limit to what you can plug into it. But we could do, and I'm not sure that you could get a pop-up to work in there, but if we built it on a different platform, that would absolutely be a really cool way to gather it. And we could still try by doing surveys, but students would have to navigate to the survey and then do it themselves. It wouldn't be kind of that in-your-face prompting. Yeah, I love that idea. That's great.
So I think I'm probably an unusual, a typical writer in the sense that I don't make a statement that my draft is now finished and now the revisions begin. Right? And I think it could be a very artificial environment when you make that decision, unless you put like a week hiatus. When do your students also have a question about that time when revisions are starting, or is it blended into the writing creative process from the beginning?
That's a great question. Interestingly, the students that we interviewed, many of them wound up sort of turning the conversation to pre-writing and idea generation. And I think that's because for sophisticated writers, experienced writers, those two things aren't separable in exactly the same way that they might be for a student who, say, has to turn in a draft to me on a particular date, right? So I'm artificially imposing some sort of demarcation. That thing that you turned in to me, that was draft 1. And the thing you turn in later, that's draft 2. But in between, there will be several iterations of that paper, hopefully, if they're doing their job, right? So it was fascinating to me how important it was for the writers that we were talking to go back to pre-writing, to idea generation, to organizing again and again. And they very much saw the whole process as being interwoven. Did that answer your question? Yeah.
Yes.
I have a question for Robin. So you mentioned that there were, for the online participants, there was like a standard distribution of people talking and everyone was participating, but I'm curious about how the project actually flowed. And so if like was the project actually moving forward, or they all had these ideas and then they came to crunch time and then one leader just said, all right, this is what we're gonna do, and then they basically just took over and it was the outspoken person who really used their idea as opposed to all these others that were flourishing, or if you'd seen anything like that?
So I can only answer that sort of from my own perspective. I was able to watch the conversations. And my biggest sense in terms of the differences between the conversations that happened face-to-face and the ones that happened online is that the groups that were meeting face-to-face often stopped a little bit earlier and headed down to lab because they sort of said, well, we can't do anything else because we don't know enough about what's out there in the lab. The groups that were online had ended up with fairly detailed schematics that they were going to go down and build, which I think is a good thing, except that because the design hasn't been as, the design scenario was not perhaps as specified as it could be, many of the teams got down to the lab and realized, oh, we were going to build this with this kind of angles, but all of the PVC connectors are 90 degrees, or something like that. I don't know whether there were other various differences because of, and I wish that I would have done some sort of analysis of those meetings once they got down to the lab. I don't have anything other than my floating around, walking around in the lab afterwards. But I think what would be really interesting is to look at the team dynamics once they got there, and whether somebody did take over at that point, or whether the people who were participating more online than we would have expected, whether they continue that mode of participation. Maybe that's a someday project.
Do you know qualitatively, did you ask them if they liked it better online versus face-to-face?
So, until I crunched the numbers, I thought that qualitatively they hated the online meetings. I did do a survey, it's in Qualtrics, and those numbers are actually statistically indistinguishable. But what I did find is there are a lot of outspoken people who really hate the online meeting. So each semester that I did this, I had 1 or 2 people show up in my office during office hours to talk about how terrible that meeting was. They were usually someone who I think, I have a sense would have been one of those people who took over the meeting had it been face-to-face, and I think that they were handicapped in that online context. But so my assumption as an instructor, until I looked at the survey numbers, was everybody hates this context. Basically what I found with the survey is that nobody loves this meeting. Everybody feels like they weren't heard as much as they would have liked, that the team went in a direction that they didn't want them to, and that people who were in the other context, because they know that there are other people doing this conversation the other way, had a better experience than they did. But everybody thinks that, in both conditions.
How about Rob and then we'll go back here?
Do you think that the fact that they knew they were being watched affected their how far outside the box, or whether they would just wander into something totally different?
It's possible. So
Focused?
I do have some sort of analysis of what they ended up building to look at whether that how far outside of the box that is, and those aren't distinguishable. But I would kind of figure that the effect of a single meeting on what they ended up building over the course of the semester is probably pretty small. So it's not really surprising to me that I don't find a difference there. I do think that there's a being watched phenomenon that affects their behavior. So when I stop into the face-to-face meetings, the conversation very abruptly changes. And they start looking at me, and they're kind of, one person trails off talking. And online, because it looks like I'm lurking there the whole time, but I tell them I'm going to be lurking in all of the meetings, I think that in some ways that does affect, but I think probably it mostly affects in good ways. So I found that my online participants, with that one exception of the group that was so excited about the Pope, mostly their conversation was entirely about what it should be. I suspect that in my face-to-face groups, when I'm not there watching the conversation, at least sometimes the conversation is about the football game that's happening on Saturday or other things that are not course related.
Robin, you showed data for 2 groups, the ESL students and then females.
Mm-hmm.
What if you were to categorize students by personality types? Because I know in one Engine 100 section, there's a personality test, and there's 4 categories. Would a student be likely to participate more if she were sanguine as opposed to ESL?
So you're talking about Myers-Briggs, right, is what they use?
Right.
So I considered that. I am not a big fan of the Myers-Briggs categories. So when I was considering it, I was considering doing some sort of introversion, extroversion thing, because I really do think that there's some other thing that's happening here as opposed to gender or non-native speaker status. But these were the things that were easiest for me to categorize specifically. I think that there are students who are disadvantaged face-to-face, and I'm not exactly sure what the appropriate characteristic umbrella term is for that group. Maybe Myers-Briggs would let me get at it, I don't know.
Any other questions for Christine or Robin? Yes,
So this question is for Robin.
So it was a single meeting. They were told, don't come to the discussion room, go somewhere with reliable internet. At least a couple of them were sitting out on the wave field.
One more from you?
Yeah.
Okay.
So as a suggestion for Robin, part of the team dynamics is speaking and making your points, and you're measuring primarily that. You aren't necessarily testing the listening skills. So I'm wondering if you could start measuring that by seeing which of these comments are thoughtful responses to somebody else's online text.
So I haven't done any sort of analysis with that, but I did consider how to take my my codes and actually look at. I considered it uptake, sort of. So some of the students say, I didn't feel listened to in the meeting, right? I didn't feel like my ideas were heard. It would be really interesting to look at, okay, so this person said this idea, how many people responded to that idea? And I like that idea a lot. I need to figure out how to do that. I need to find some examples somewhere to read about how someone else did it, I think.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank Robin, Fowler, and Christine Modey very much, and let's give them a final round of applause.